What's going on, guys? Welcome back into the channel. Today we're going to be doing our video covering pitching ratings and which ratings matter at each of these positions within MLB The Show. Specifically, we're on MLB The Show 21 today, but these ratings will apply across multiple years and multiple MLB The Show games. And in addition to that, like I said, we're going to be covering the entire pitching staff as a whole. So we're going to cover everything from starting pitchers through the bullpen, which would be relief pitchers and closing pitchers, and various different roles that go into those things. So the first thing to cover here, which is probably the most important of any role within the pitching staff, is your pitching rotation and your standard starting pitchers. You're going to have 5 of these most of the time. Sometimes teams will run 6 and do some different things with that. But what ratings actually matter for these guys whenever we're talking about starting pitchers? Let's go ahead and jump into that. So the first thing that I want to talk about in terms of starting pitchers, whenever we actually jump into their attributes / ratings here, the first thing that I actually want to talk about is their pitch types and not even necessarily their pitching stats. So one thing that sets apart starting pitchers from relief pitchers and closing pitchers more often than not, this isn't 100% of the time, but your starting pitchers are going to be guys that have pretty much 4 or 5 pitch types. They're going to have various different pitch types, and they switch things up throughout the game because they have to last through about 6, 7, or more innings depending on what you're trying to do with them, as opposed to a relief pitcher who will generally have maybe 3 pitch types. Some good relief pitchers will have more than that, but it's a general basis that you're going to see more pitch types for your starting pitchers because they're going to have to go further through a game and they're going to have to switch things up as they go throughout that game. One note that I want to add in terms of pitch types is I do want to kind of talk about what matters pitch type wise for starting pitchers, and that is kind of more so a variety than anything in particular. Generally speaking, you want to have at least one fastball, and then you want to have one sideways breaking pitch, would be something like a slider or a cutter, something that has east-west type of action, and then generally speaking, you also want to have something that has north-south type of action, like a changeup, a sinker, a curveball, something like that, because as a starting pitcher, like I said, you're going to want to mix things up, and so you're going to want to have pitches that can go in various different directions, especially when you're facing batters on different sides of the plate and everything of that nature. Your pitch types are actually incredibly important. Then the first stat that I actually want to talk about here, the first actual rating that I want to talk about, is stamina, because this is something that I think is one of the most important stats for a starting pitcher that probably gets a little bit overlooked because of how basic it is. Most starting pitchers are going to have in the 70s in terms of their stamina. However, from my perspective, whenever I play franchise mode, whenever I play in games, I like to have my starting pitchers go as many innings as possible. I'm very often in low-scoring games, 1-run, 2-run games where I haven't allowed a hit or I haven't allowed a run or anything of that nature, and I want that starting pitcher to be able to continue on within the game and not have to get tired and taken out of the game just simply because they're tired. So whenever I take a look at starting pitchers, the higher their stamina, the better, in my personal opinion. I like to see those guys that have stamina up into the 80s and 90s because that means that they can go extra innings without it risking an injury or risking them getting tired enough that it causes a problem for them or anything like that. I like to know that I have a guy that can go all 9 innings if he has a good game. If he has a shutout, I want to know that I have a guy that can do that. We are actually going to skip pitching clutch from the starting pitcher's perspective. Now, there's a reason for that. Pitching clutch is something that I almost exclusively reserve for relief pitchers because a lot of the times whenever your starting pitcher later in the innings gets into a situation where they need help, they have runners on base and stuff like that, you're going to bring in a relief pitcher to take their place. And so those are the guys that need the clutch rating in order to get out of those situations. Now, that's not to say that clutch doesn't matter at all for starting pitchers. Obviously, if you have these guys getting into those types of situations and you want to prevent runs from scoring, your pitching clutch is going to be crucial in those situations. It's just more important for those other positions than it is for starting pitchers. Then whenever we actually start to get into the hits per 9, home runs per 9, strikeouts per 9, and base on balls per 9 numbers, it's really just going to come down to a matter of what you want to do with those pitchers. And so all 4 of these ratings are very crucial to what you do as a starting pitcher. whether you allow hits, whether you allow runs, whether you strike batters out, or you walk a lot of guys. These things matter, and they also don't matter depending on what type of pitcher you have. And so you obviously want these numbers to be as high as possible, but some pitchers are going to be better at allowing ground balls and getting those outs that way, and some pitchers are going to be better at getting strikeouts. Now, of these 4 ratings, what ratings do I like to see higher more than the others? I would prefer to see a high home runs per 9 number and a high strikeouts per 9 number. These 2 things are going to be crucial in my opinion because I like to strike batters out, and I like to prevent solo shot home runs that are, in crucial situations and things like that. I just don't like to allow scores, and so when you're striking batters out and you're preventing them from hitting it over the wall, that is a good formula for preventing runs. I will personally say that I don't mind a average hits per 9 number or base on balls per 9 number because, like I said, I favor being able to strike guys out and not allow home runs from a starting pitcher perspective. This might vary depending on how you pitch within the game, so you kind of have to make a decision on that, but I personally say that home runs per 9 and Ks per 9 are the most important out of these 2 stats. And out of all the stats so far that I've mentioned, your home runs per 9, your Ks per 9, and your stamina are the 3 core attributes. Then, from a starting pitcher's perspective, we have 3 ratings left. We have their velocity, their control, and their break. And of those 3 things, again, it is subjective in terms of what you're actually going to be doing with these pitchers. But from my perspective, I generally like to have higher velocity numbers. You can get away with a lot of times in MLB The Show, and I think that you guys will see this if you watch any gameplay online or anything like that. Everybody wants the guy that can throw the fastest because it is hard to see the ball coming in. It's hard to hit that type of a ball, and very often you're going to see guys with high velocity that are lower overalls being as effective as higher overall pitchers. So I consider velocity, personally speaking, to be the most important out of all of these categories, and really I consider velocity to be a core attribute. However, that doesn't mean that we can't use control and break with our pitchers, and that doesn't mean that a guy that has high control or a guy that has high break is not useful. Those guys can be extremely effective on the mound, especially throughout the length of a game. If you have a guy with high control, they're going to prevent walking batters. They're going to hit their spots whenever they throw their pitches, and that can result in strikeouts in itself. Now, what I will say is from a real baseball perspective, the most important attribute for a starting pitcher or any pitcher in the major leagues is going to be their break and the rotation on their pitches. Because essentially what they've broken it down to in recent years whenever they've studied this is the more the ball rotates, the harder it is to hit, the harder it is to get a direct hit, the harder it is to actually do anything from the batting side of the ball. And so break, from a realism perspective, is by far the most important rating within the game. Like I said, though, MLB The Show as a game does not necessarily reflect 100% to real life, so I tend to favor velocity over anything, but break and control, both incredibly important for pitchers, and like I said, it's going to depend on what you're doing. From a starting pitcher's perspective, you might favor control more than anything because you want to try to avoid getting guys on base, especially whenever you are going to be in the game for 5, 6, 7, 8, or 9 innings. Next up, I actually want to talk about closing pitchers specifically, and I want to talk about their role and what is most important for them. So from a closing pitcher's perspective, like I said, they're not always going to have 5 pitches. A lot of times they'll just have 3. And what you're looking for from their pitch types is a very fast fastball most of the time, and then 2 really good break pitches, whether that be a curveball, a slider, a cutter. It needs to be essentially balls that get movement, because these are guys that are going to be looking for strikeouts, guys that are going to be looking for swings and misses, the guys that are brought in crucial situations. Likewise, whenever we go and look at these players' stats, we're going to be talking about the most important ratings from these guys being their pitching clutch. That is absolutely crucial because a closer is coming in to close out in a clutch situation, and so you have to be prepared to execute in those clutch situations. So your pitching clutch is incredibly important, and then from there, the second most important rating, or possibly the most important rating for a closing pitcher, is going to be their break. Shortly behind their break would be their velocity. Generally speaking, from a closing pitcher's perspective, you're looking for somebody that has high velocity, high break, they can get a lot of movement on the ball, and they can generate strikeouts. And so likewise, whenever we talk about good closing pitchers, we're going to be looking at a high K per 9 number, and a lot of the time we're also looking at a high home runs per 9 number, because you certainly don't want your relievers coming in and giving up solo shot home runs or anything like that. You want them to close out the game, and from a closing pitcher's perspective, these are absolutely crucial. So like I said, you'll see with closing pitchers, a lot of the time they're going to have super high break numbers, and that's probably going to be one of their best, if not their best, attributes or ratings overall, in conjunction with their velocity. A lot of these guys will have good control, but there are times that closing pitchers are just really good at throwing a breaking ball that doesn't have crazy good control. Control is not the end-all be-all for closing pitchers. Rather, we're looking at pitching clutch and, like I said, velocity and break, and then we're trying to not allow home runs and get strikeouts. Then I want to make a note of the couple of different pitching roles that are within the bullpen. So the long relief pitcher is very much just another starting pitcher type of player. A long reliever is expected to come into a game, whether you're losing by a bunch of runs or whatever, they're expected to carry a few innings at the very least. Long relievers are essentially there to fill innings. They're there to eat innings. That's kind of what their role is. And so you're going to be looking at a lot of the same things as a starting pitcher. You want them to have the stamina to go multiple innings. That's why you'll see usually your relief pitcher with the highest stamina is probably going to be put into that bullpen role. A lot of times you will see like a sixth starting pitcher taking on that long relief role. And a lot of times within the major leagues, what ends up happening is a kind of failed starting pitching prospect that comes up to the majors that maybe doesn't have service time in the minors, or rather doesn't have time left in the minors or anything like that. They leave them up in the majors as a long relief pitcher in low stress situations to work on their stuff, to work on what they have going and potentially develop into a starting pitcher. So those ratings are very much the same. And then we're going to talk about setup guys. Setup guys are pretty much the same as a closing pitcher in a lot of respects. So if your closing pitcher is coming in the 9th and your starting pitcher is essentially expected to go through 7 innings, you're going to have 1 inning in between there, the 8th inning that you have to bridge. Most times the setup man is considered to be that 8th inning guy. So your starting pitcher comes out in the 7th, you have the setup guy come in that bridges the gap between the 7th and the 9th, and then you bring your closer in to close out the game in the 9th inning. So your setup guy is going to be very much the same as your closer. You're looking for somebody with good break, good velocity, good hits per 9, Ks per 9, home runs per 9. Essentially, clutch. You're looking for somebody that is very much the same model as a closing pitcher, somebody that is going to come in and guarantee you an inning where they're not going to give up a run, they're not going to give up a home run, and they're probably going to strike a few batters out. The final role within the bullpen then is the middle relief pitcher. These are guys that aren't going to be considered those setup, lockdown guys that are expected to come in and fill that void of a single inning. Sometimes these guys are expected to go 2 innings or 3 innings. These guys will be, let's say your starting pitcher comes out in the 5th or the 6th and you need somebody to cover an extra inning or 2. These are guys that are going to come in and fill that gap. They're not going to necessarily be a long relief pitcher where they come in low stress situations where the game is already lost or it's a blowout or something like that. These are guys that you're going to bring into the game and expect to keep you competitive, but they're not expected to, guarantee you, a solid inning. So from a middle relief pitcher's perspective, what actually matters to these guys? Well, pitch type can be just about anything for these guys. They can have a couple pitches, they can have a few pitches, they can have break, they can not have break. Essentially, this is where you're going to see a lot of guys that vary between whether they are a guy that are a contact pitcher, a strikeout pitcher, whatever it might be. there's really no set defined makeup for a guy like this. It just has to be a guy that you can use that can get you through a couple of innings without giving up the game or anything like that. So they're not going to have crazy high stamina. They're probably not going to have super high pitching clutch. Otherwise, they would be a setup man or a relief pitcher. They're probably just going to have solid numbers in terms of their hits per 9, home runs per 9, and Ks per 9. You're not looking for anything crazy high. And a lot of times you're going to get guys here that don't even have very good velocity. They probably don't have very good break or anything like that. You know, it depends. It really depends. There's guys that range all over the place whenever you talk about a middle relief pitcher. You know, those guys with the best of the best in terms of their break and their velocity, those guys kind of are reserved for those closing and setup roles. That's just how it works out. So, you know, if you have other relief pitchers that don't necessarily fit that bill, they tend to slot into the middle relief spots. And with all of that being said, you know, hopefully this video helped you guys out and gave you some valuable information in terms of what it actually matters at each of these pitching positions for this pitching, you know, for this position group. Like I said, you know, starting pitchers are pretty straightforward. You want them to go a volume of innings, and so certain things are going to matter differently between them and relief pitchers, whether it be a middle relief pitcher or a setup relief pitcher or a closing pitcher. So these things matter differently. Hopefully that gave you guys a general understanding of how these things work and some of the things that I look for within each of these roles. If this video did help you guys out or gave you some ideas or provided some valuable information, make sure you leave a like on the video, subscribe to the channel if you're new, and comment down below with anything else you guys could use help with. Like I said, I'll see you guys in the next video. Hope you guys have a good one.